Hey everybody, it's CountMRVHS and welcome back to another Wainriders update. This is a video series where we look at progress for the upcoming mod Total War Wainriders. This is a mod that's being developed for Rome Total War, the original Alexander expansion. Now I do want to clear something up because you will occasionally see people making comments like, well, I don't have the original, I've got the remaster, how can I play this? There does appear to be a fair amount of confusion on this point, and to be fair, I don't believe, is it CA who's responsible for this? I don't know, but regardless, no one has done themselves any favors by sort of hiding this, and that is that when you buy the remaster on Steam, Rome Total War, the sort of the original Rome Total War, by which I mean the first game of that title, not Rome 2, when you buy Rome Total War on Steam, you are getting the remastered version. That is the only option that you see to purchase. However, that does include the original version of the game as well. I believe it's just right in there included with all the rest of the stuff. The original game is like 2 gigabytes or something like that. It is not a huge, space hog. The remaster is something like 45, I want to say, maybe even more. So they just kind of dropped it in there. So if you've got the remaster, like if you didn't buy Rome Total War on release like I did, and you haven't sort of always had a version of it installed on your various machines, then just be assured, if you are interested in this mod and you're a little concerned because you only have the remaster, you should have the original game. I think as we get closer to releasing this thing, we're going to have to do a little bit of a discussion on how to make this work for people who only have the remaster and maybe haven't ever done any modding on original Rome, because there may be a little bit of nuance to it, but it really isn't that complicated. It's like if you can move files between folders and move one folder into another folder and change some settings, then you're good. It's not going to be a super complicated thing. But anyway, just wanted to make that very clear. At some point, I'll do a comprehensive video, I think, on like why we used the remaster, or sort of the original rather than the remaster, to sort of build the mod. There are several answers to it. Some of them are just boring but very important answers. And one of those is that we have been developing this for like 6 years now, 7 years, maybe more. We started this certainly by 2019, and I think it was probably by 2018, maybe even 2017, when I started just sort of getting the concept together for the mod and the period. So this has been in the works for a very long time, and that's really good because it allows us on the one hand to iterate, to test things out, to see how they work, to have a long sit with our ideas before we're happy, before we're sure that we're really happy with them, right? There are downsides as well to taking your sweet time, and one of those is that you forget stuff, at least in my case. And especially since we're using Discord to do all of our modding communication, it is so easy to lose track of threads of conversation and just kind of forget things that had been settled a long time ago. Now, one of the things I was thinking about in preparation for this video was the Druedain. The Druedain are the Pukul men, right? The wild men, probably most familiar to fans of Lord of the Rings in the, I believe it's Return of the King, where they are met by King Theoden on his ride down into Gondor. Gon Buri Gon is their chief, and he leads the Rohirrim through the Stonewain Valley, and they're able to avoid some Orcish and Easterling patrols on the main road and get to Minas Tirith just in the nick of time. So the wild men, the Pukul men, the Druedain do play an important, if sort of overlooked, role in the books. And that role, of course, is easier to overlook because for the past 25 years now, I would dare say most people's familiarity with Middle-earth comes almost entirely from the movies. Certainly, even if you have read the books, it may be the case that you've seen the movies more often than you've read all of the books. And I can say from my own experience that the movies do exert a strong impression on your mind and your imagination of the events of the story. Now, fortunately, in my case, I'd been reading these books for like, let's see, like a decade, I guess, before the movies came out. And I've been reading them and rereading them, so I have a pretty strong sense of my own of how things look, and I naturally revert to that when I'm reading. But for many people, they don't. And so the fact that the Druedain were not in the movies, I think, makes them a bit of a surprise to people. So if this is you, we're going to talk about them a little bit in this video in the context of how they are portrayed in this mod. And, you know, I'm going to have to rein it in a bit. I had planned to do a much bigger thing today, but I'm already, I don't know, it feels like 10 minutes in. So what I wanted to look at was the Black Forest tribes. This is a faction along the western coast of Enedwaith, Minhiriath, and Erin Vorn in the middle parts of the Third Age. This is not a faction that is named in the lore, but there are people living here, and the way they are represented in the mod is intended to reflect what we think would be reasonable for the way the people in the books who live here are described. And that means that this is a relatively low-tech, probably the most low-tech faction on the map. People are described as numerous but barbarous fisherfolk, fowlers. These are the people who in the Second Age were like the native people of Minhiriath and Enedwaith, so non-Numenorian. And when the Numenorian kings started coming in and felling the trees along the Grey Flood for the wood for their ships, these people eventually fought back. Then when the war between Sauron and the elves broke out, their land was essentially destroyed, and they fled into the Erin Vorn, or at least some of them did. We know in the Third Age, 1,000 years after that, there were people living along the coast here, but there were also still people living in the Erin Vorn, which is a very different environment, and so we'll get to that when we get into the campaign map. But I did want to start with a look at our beautiful what do we call this? The main menu map, the faction selection map, which is the first thing you see once you start up a single-player campaign. And when you select the Black Forest Tribes faction, you are greeted with this beautiful, it's essentially a unit card for this unit. This is the, I think it's the Blackwood Warriors is the name of this unit. Two-handed axeman about to brain a hapless swordsman of Gondor who is lying at his feet. This faction is, a fairly provocative unit card, but it makes sense, I think, because these guys have never been exactly friendly with the Druedain. And so that informs a bit about how we imagine the politics will work out. Just to give you a sense of it, their nearest neighbor is, let's see, probably this faction, the Chieftain of the Angren, which is really near what would later be known as Isengard. They are somewhat related in the sense that both of these factions have an element of non-Numenorian, what you might call middlemen. These are the people who were not necessarily, enslaved by Sauron at any particular point, but they were never strong allies of the Druedain either. They were somewhat neutral, kind of kept to themselves. So there's a bit of a kinship here, but no doubt these factions are going to come into conflict. And then, of course, we do have the Kingdom of Arnor up north, which is in some ways an even closer faction to worry about. But then down here, just across the mouth of the Isen, you don't have to go very far before you get into Gondor. So there's a couple of Dunedainic factions nearby. We imagine they're going to come into conflict. And I think one of the fun things about playing these guys will be playing a very low-tech faction with very sort of low amounts of armor, but some very interesting mechanics regarding having to rely on ambushes, skirmishers, charges, fear, those types of things. And one of the tools you'll have in your toolbox when playing as the Black Forest Tribes is the Druedain. So let's jump into the campaign map. We'll talk a little bit about how that's going to look. All right, now before we get into the campaign map, I actually want to jump in to this little sidebar, if you will. This is the Druedain and their existence in the sort of the western coasts of Middle-earth. Now, earlier I mentioned that one of the disadvantages of working on a mod over a long period of time is that you kind of forget stuff. At least that's true for me. It's impossible for me to kind of hold in my mind everything that we've decided and how we've sort of traced through lore and whether some of our decisions are strictly based in lore or are based on sort of reasonable speculation and extrapolation from things that we do know. The Druedain having a presence in Erin Vorn is one of those questions. I haven't looked extensively through all of the relevant texts this morning, but oftentimes my first place to jump in when I have a quick question about something I just want to get sort of pointed in the right direction is TolkienGateway.net. This is essentially a wiki of Middle-earth lore, and it's something that I look at and trust to a relatively high degree, certainly compared to other sources I can find online. But I do go back to the books themselves quite frequently, and this is a good sort of reason why. Now they've included here on this this discussion of Erin Vorn. You probably can't see this too well, but this is a painting by Angus McBride, who I love as an artist, and he is describing here or painting here what looks to be a couple of Druedain descended fellows going through evidently the Erin Vorn and being ambushed potentially by some wild men. And there are, in fact, what look to be Pukul faces here alongside the bridge, along with some sort of swirly decorations and things. It's a really interesting painting, and I do like the sort of the vision Angus McBride brings to Middle-earth. It's a very different one from what we're now familiar with the films. Nevertheless, I'm not sure where this particular element comes from, the idea of the Druedain living in Erin Vorn. I suspect that much like we ourselves in the Wainriders modding team sort of came to this conclusion, I suspect that maybe for the Middle-earth role-playing people, who were no doubt the ones commissioning this particular painting, that it was very reasonable to believe that Druedain would have lived in the Erin Vorn. And so if you remember where there is a reference to such an existence of Druedain in the Erin Vorn, please let me know. I think the reason we arrived at this was because the Blackwood is similar in a lot of ways to the Forest of Brethil in the Silmarillion, right? That's in Beleriand. This is a very sort of defensive settlement of men, very isolated, living in sort of a constant state of guard, almost sort of like hidden in the forest, right? And we know that in Unfinished Tales, Tolkien has sort of an extensive essay called The Druedain, which discusses them living among the people of Haleth, or the Haladin, and in particular around the Forest of Brethil. And so it would make sense that, especially given we conceive of some kinship between the people living along the coasts of western Enedwaith and Minhiriath, we imagine them to be somehow related to the people of Haladin, maybe distantly, right? Like they're certainly not their descendants or anything, because I don't think any survived the downfall of Beleriand. But given that men sort of migrated west over many ages of time in various stages, it would be reasonable to suspect that the people still living here were more akin to the people of Haleth than to maybe other groups. So that's how we're sort of imagining it. There is in the Forest of Erin Vorn a sort of Haladin type element, which makes up the sort of strongest component, or the leadership component, perhaps, if you will, of the Black Forest Tribes faction. And then sort of under them, but more numerous, we have the fairly numerous but barbarous fisher folk that are referenced as living along the coasts, around the mouths of the Grey Flood and the Eisen. And so there's different styles of warfare between each of those two groups. And then also you've got sort of attached to them the Druedain. Now, with regard to the Druedain, I did look up and tried to find where they would have lived in Middle-earth, if there's any reference to them living in the Erin Vorn, and there isn't here, but I did find something that I did want to point out in Tolkien Gateway, just as a warning to myself, but to anybody else who might use this as a resource. It says here that in the Third Age, after the Great Plague of the year 1638, and in the days of the kings of Gondor, a few tribes of Druedain lived as fishers and fowlers in the marshlands of the mouths of the river Grathlow and the river Eisen, and on the coasts between the mouths of those rivers. And that raised my eyebrows immediately, because that was not in my mind, and I've looked at those sources many, many times. And so, fortunately, Tolkien Gateway does a good job of referencing where they get their ideas so you can check them. This first source is from the Battles of the Fords of Isen, which is in Unfinished Tales. It's Appendix 2. It's the first paragraph of the note. I've got that right here, and I will read that to you to sort of tell you where they got this claim, that there are tribes of Druedain living in the marshes of the mouths of the River Gwathlo and Isen. So here's the sentence. In those days, the region was little peopled. In the marshlands of the mouths of Greyflood and Isen lived a few tribes of, quote, wild men, which is capitalized, by the way, fishers and fowlers, but akin in race and speech to the Druedain of the woods of Anorian. Now, what does that mean, right? How much weight do we put on that word akin? Akin in race and speech to the Druedain of the woods of Anorian. So to me, it's very interesting. My first tendency is to take that word akin in race and speech to mean not identical. In other words, these people are not Druedain, which I think it's fair to say. These are not actually Druedain, but they are related. So that sort of suggests to me that there is this other group, that there is sort of what we would think of as sort of the typical middlemen, the fishers and fowlers living along the coasts, right? Indistinguishable from any person who might be walking around Middle-earth in that period of the world. We've got a second group, which is the Druedain, living, in various places. And then we've got this third group, which is akin in race and speech to the Druedain, which must look like an amalgamation of the two types, right? So maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but it is sort of an interesting point. I think that Tolkien Gateway is a little too, is reading too much maybe into that akin, or maybe maybe the editor here was just reading it quickly and assumed, okay, that's the Druedain. They saw the words wild men, they figured that's Druedain. I'm not so sure that that's the way that should be read. In our mod, we're going to see basically typical examples of men living in those places. But if you're playing as the Black Forest tribes, you will be able, in a few places on the map, to recruit Druedain. So I wanted to get basically that out of the way. One other sort of interesting related point here is the idea that the Druedain were unfriendly to the people of Enedwaith and Minhiriath. And this is cited in the reference where, in the Second Age, people fled, the middlemen in the area fled from Sauron and the Númenóreans and fled into Erin Vorn, for example. And it said that they did not go south of the Isen and into the region of Andrast. And we'll sort of look at that when we get to the campaign map here in a second. But the idea was they did not go there because they were afraid of the Druedain. They were afraid of the Pukul men. They used poisoned arrows, and it's a bad place to go. We don't want to go there. So that's another interesting way to read a potential relationship between the Druedain and the other, the middlemen who were living, kind of in Enedwaith / Minhiriath. Did they have a close relationship like the one that is described in, as existing in the First Age among the people of Haleth and the Druedain, or did they have an antagonistic relationship? Or was there a mix of both? Now, for the mod, for the purposes of interest, we think it's more interesting if there is a friendly relationship with the Druedain and at least one faction that is playable on the map, so that you don't just see them as always hostile rebels. So if you are a Druedain fan, you can play the Black Forest tribes and and have some fun with them. Let's take a look now at the campaign app. Oh, one other thing, actually. One other very interesting thing, and I'm glad I remembered this. This is in the Unfinished Tales. It is note 13 in the section titled The Druedain. Near the end of note 13, Christopher Tolkien writes, "A marginal jotting states that after the battles of the Fords of Isen, it was found that many Druedain did indeed survive in the Druaith Iar." The Druaith Iar, by the way, is the region north of the White Mountains in the west, so between the White Mountains and the Isen. Many Druedain did indeed survive in the Druidth hour, for they came forth from the caves where they dwelt to attack remnants of Saruman's forces that had been driven away southwards. That is a fascinating tidbit, I thought. So the Druedain, in addition to playing the role of escort to Theoden and the Rohirrim on their way to Minas Tirith and the Return of the King, played a more active role in the west as well, attacking the remnants of Sauron's forces that had been driven away southwards. So after the battles of the fords of Isen, right? So that's just fascinating to think about. We tend to overlook the Druedain completely, or maybe associate them with guides, in the case of Gon Buri Gon, pictured here in John Howe's painting. But we can imagine them also playing a more active role in other parts of Middle-earth as late as the end of the Third Age. So that certainly seems to be reasonable precedent to include them in our mod. But let's now just switch over to the campaign map here. So here we are on the good old Wainriders campaign map, and we've got, let's see, we've got 3 settlements if you are playing as the Black Forest tribes. Now, of course, the usual caveats here apply. This is a work in progress. You'll notice that all 3 of these settlements are losing population, and this one has a red face, and in fact, no garrison. Well, all of this stuff is going to be changed. The economy's got to be reworked. We've got to set up the initial armies and so on, and get all the buildings with their effects lined up so that it will make sense to play as this faction. But this at least gives you an idea of the territory you will control when you choose this faction to play. Your capital is Vornhallen. And again, this gets back to the idea that we really see somewhat of a 2-tiered society, or at least I do. Maybe tiers is slightly too strong a word for it, but there are different cultural groups here for sure. Vornhallen, we're picturing more like the people of Brethil. These are woodsmen. These are somewhat related to like the kind of men who would live in Mirkwood, let's say. Not related in, in terms of blood or anything like that, but that these are fairly robust, rough and tough guys who live in the woods. And they are very, very much isolated, more so than the men who lived in the Vales of Anduin and, the fringes of Mirkwood. But nevertheless, they have this kind of rough existence in Vornhallen. And so we see them taking up raids potentially, sort of at this point expanding, because Gondor and Arnor are very much in decline and have been for, certainly in Arnor's case, for quite some time, centuries. And Gondor, it's been a long time since there's been, serious traffic through Enedwaith. So it makes sense to us that this would be a prime time for some enterprising chieftain to begin to expand and extend his sway down the coast. Now, sort of in keeping with the lore, we're keeping the expansion going to the south initially, because the people who lived here are described as being afraid of the elves who dwelt north of the Baranduin. So these are the high elves of the Lindon area. And so it certainly makes sense. They wouldn't try raids against the elves, even if they knew how to conduct those. But they would certainly try to extend their influence in the south. In terms of your units, of course, we'll take a look at some of them, because Webb is reworking some of the units in terms of the levies and the rebel versions. And so we'll look at some of those in more detail in a little while. But one of the other purposes of this video, or this series of videos, is showing the settlements, kind of where they are and the names. And so I'd like to just take off the fog of war here so we can see maybe what kind of nearby threats you'd have to consider. I should also point out too, Valor mentioned to me that this build that you're looking at right now is actually a little bit out of date. I've got sort of an update that I neglected to install, evidently. Well, because I turned off OneDrive because it was being so annoying. So I need to return that back on and then wait a million years for it to sync and get everything updated. So we'll see that a little bit later. I don't think it's anything huge, but certainly the way settlements look, that appeared to him off in my videos. So sort of turn everything up a notch from what you're seeing here, if that makes sense. So the big first thing you'll notice is that the coastal tribes, or the Black Forest tribes rather, is a faction that doesn't share borders with anybody initially. And it may be, it's almost unique in that. I'm just looking at the map here, I can see that one other faction is similar, and that is the Haradrim, the tribes of the Harad. But even they, arguably, within one turn or two, are going to be bordering another faction. But theoretically, the Black Forest tribes could conquer a few settlements and still not really have to worry about a major faction getting involved with them. An easy grab would certainly be Ether Berain. This is the settlement at the mouth of the Branduin. Because the borders here, there's no ford, at least at this point. There is up here by Sarn Athrad. But you could take this without any concern. And then you would have the next natural place to go would be Rithmalin, sort of as a single large province that would shield your others to the west. And then it would be a question of where you want to go from there, because at this point, now you do begin to share borders with the other factions. Arnor is just to your north, and they will be initially at war with Angmar, and so there may be an opportunity there for you to exploit some of that. You could potentially cross the Brandywine here, if you're not scared of elves and, tall, men out of the sea. Or you could continue just maybe ignoring them, hoping that their war with Angmar is going to distract them long enough for you to capture what is probably the biggest prize in the region, and that is the settlement of Tharbad. And this is a relatively large, certainly built-up settlement. I'm not sure exactly what's going to be in it when the mod is finished, because there may be some things we want to represent. Maybe we want to show that there's been a great deal of decay. Maybe there will be certain buildings that will need to be started from the ground up. So you'll have your work cut out for you, but this is important, if nothing else, as a really crucial sort of chokehold in the region. It's the only ford, it's the only crossing, rather, south into Enedwaith. Now, you do have a couple of provinces to the south of the Grey Flood initially. These could be places that maybe you just hold off on, or you don't expand from for a little while, although you certainly could here as well. There is a ford right near Lymphalis, which is going to get you down into Druedain, which is, we talked about that a few minutes ago. This is a region with actually several settlements. In 4th Age Total War, there was like one settlement down here at Andrast and one settlement up here, but that was it. So it's a little more dense. You have a few more options here, but it's not too much, I think, so that you can start to expand a little bit without really making yourself obviously a target for, say, Gondor, who does own the Anphalis, the Pinithgelin. So if you start conquering into here, if you go down here, you will start to, share a border with them. So that is going to be a consideration. The other thing to really keep in mind is if you are a 4th Age player, like I am, you're going to have to relearn just the fact that this is not a solid border anymore. So you can't just say, okay, Lymphalis, it's fine, no one's ever going to conquer it, only threats are going to come from the east. Not necessarily true. If you see Gondor expanding up here, you do have to worry about it. So again, it may be useful to kind of launch simultaneous attacks eastward from your starting settlements, try to get some of that inland territory and capture these very well built up roads all the way down to the region of the chiefdom of the Angren. You could conquer basically all the way to the White Mountains, and you'd be in, I think it's safe to say, like friendly cultural territory. And again, I'm not 100% on this, but I think that it would certainly be easier to bring these places under your control than it would to conquer central Gondor or whatever. So we do have some new settlement names here, and we've got a couple of enterprising people on the Discord whose names I forget at the moment, unfortunately, but have taken it upon themselves to go through our settlement names and just kind of proofread them, because they noticed on some of the other videos that maybe there were a couple of errors with regard to accents or spellings of some of the names. And so that is fantastic. Having another set or two of eyes to just double check our work is really great. So they're hard at work at that, and if they see anything here like Gobel Tower Inn, Cowin Druedain, I think this one has been there since 4th Age times, but regardless, it's good to have a bit of feedback there. So you've got quite a lot of options. You could expand pretty significantly before getting involved in a major war, and that is good because your armies are relatively low tech. and you'll need to get, I think, a lot of men to be really a threat to the much stronger units of like the Druedain. So with that kind of out of the way, I want to jump into the units. We'll take a look at sort of what Web has been doing with regard to retexturing some of these things to give them different variants. We'll talk about how they're going to maybe pop up in your gameplay, whether you choose this faction or not. And what we're looking at here does not represent the full roster of the Black Forest tribes. This is primarily levies, which would be available to other factions if they conquer this territory, as well as rebel units who might spawn if there is a settlement with very low happiness in this region. So again, this is not really the whole of the Black Forest tribes. This is just a selection. And we're sort of starting from the lower tier stuff and gradually working our way up through here. But we've got a couple of variants of the Coastal Hunters. This, of course, is a tier 1 unit for the Black Forest tribes. And if you conquer some of that territory, you can get a version, and you may see a rebel version with slightly darker colors as well. Another low-ish tier unit, this would be tier 2 for the Black Forest tribes, is the Coastal Raiders. This is kind of going to be your mainstay a little bit if you're playing as this faction, because you don't have a lot of melee units. But I remember certainly how they're set up currently, they're pretty respectable. I mean, they are not going to slug it out with the Druedain unless there is some significant advantage. Maybe you've got them pinned from a couple of different angles. Maybe there's you're taking advantage of some forest bonuses or terrain. But for the most part, these are going to be a pretty solid unit, certainly for those years of initial expansion. And of course, this is a levy unit as well that is going to be available to other factions who conquer your territory. And you can expect to see them in a rebel version also, with a little bit of a shield and insignia, a little bit of rebel pride, if you will, pride in their independence. Long spears are, and I can't remember if this is a tier 2 or tier 3 unit for the Black Forest tribes. But this is an interesting one. I remember playing with this kind of unit in Viking Invasion 2, which is a very long, very long-speared unit, and being confused when I was first playing with them about how best to use them. They seem defensive because they're spears, but in reality they worked out better as an aggressive unit, and you would have like a couple of units of them to sort of hunt cavalry. And so this is going to be very important for the Black Forest tribes because you have no native cavalry. I think you can eventually train some cav if you expand and get into different territories that have it, but in your own homelands, no cav. So you will need some answer to enemy cavalry, and this is going to be it. You've got essentially your pikemen. So this is kind of a reference to Dunland's pikes, which we would later see, of course, in the Third Age, the Fourth Age actually. But this is also potentially a levy unit and a rebel unit that you may end up fighting. And now we get into the more interesting stuff. So this is the Tribal Warrior Levy and Tribal Warrior Rebel unit. So this is not a unit that you can train as the Black Forest tribes. What it is kind of a downgraded version of your bodyguard that is available only to like rebels or other factions. So your bodyguard unit as the Black Forest tribes is like this unit in style, in terms of how it fights. Shield, helmet, javelin, and spear. But unlike that, your unit is going to be better armed. So your Tribal Warrior is not the name, but it's your bodyguard unit, and it's going to be with mail. So this is the one unit in the Black Forest tribes roster that is going to be significantly armored. And so for the levy version, for the rebel version of these, that armor is going to be a bit of a downgrade. I'm not sure exactly what their stats are going to look like, but they are going to be probably slightly worse than the bodyguard version, I would imagine, or maybe just their experience will be a bit lower. But this is going to be sort of a higher tier levy unit. So if you conquer into this territory, you can eventually get some very nice versatile spear and jab units, which I really like to see. We went with a lot of spear units in this mod, so I'm happy about that. And then we get into, okay, the last sort of levy unit, essentially, but it's not a levy, is the Warhounds. And of course, this is not the Warhound, this is a handler. But there are no levy war dogs available. So the Black Forest tribes are the only ones who get that particular unit. But rebel units, you may find them. So that's what they're going to look like. So don't be surprised. And then finally we get into the Druedain. So there are 4 different sort of versions, but they're really just different retextures of 2 units. One thing that you may remember from 4th Age Total War is that the Druedain were, I believe, entirely javelins. I don't think there were any bowmen. I think they were just javelins and spears. So we had 1 unit, I believe, in 4th Age Total War. We have doubled that for Wainriders. So there are 2 units, 2 styles at any rate, of Druedain. And so these guys are the Druedain Hunter. And then we've got a Rebel version of that, if we want Rebel versions of that. Some of these are sort of things that we may or may not include. I think I'm happy to see Rebels, I believe, is what I voted for. I can't quite remember. But we've also got a Javelin version, Javelins and Spears. So it'll be interesting to see. We've got a couple of flavors of Druedain, you know, topless, non-topless, essentially, depending on how you like them. So that's how that all is shaping up to look. So with all that, with the campaign map, where are we going to go next? Probably up to Angmar, actually. There's been a little bit, not too much. Actually, I think there's only 1 unit that needed to be added in terms of levies, but it might still be fun to look at this faction again, talk a bit about the names and so on. But let me know if there's any faction that you are particularly interested to see, maybe more in terms of, you know, campaign map stuff, strategy, that type of thing. And I'll be curious to check it out. We'll have another one of these in a little while. Take care until then.